Good morning. It is good to be with you. I'm Chris, one of the pastors here, and we'll be continuing our series, Forged in Faithfulness. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 40. Just want to welcome back Pastor Tally from Armenia. We prayed for him and his trip, and got to hear just a little bit this morning from him. And God really answered prayer. That trip was fruitful. And so we're excited to hear from him. We're figuring out a time that he can give a report on what God is doing over in the Middle East. It's spectacular. And hopefully there's opportunities for us to continue to be involved. We did have just an incident this last Wednesday night. And this bag was found here Wednesday evening and by our security guards. And so if you see guys in red hoodies or red shirts, if you're a Star Trek fan, it's very fitting. All this, now I know there's Trekkies in the room. They found this bag and immediately, sitting here on the stage and we're unsure, and it was kind of open. And so they looked inside and they pulled out. They saw some ear protection, another one here, some glasses, and then some targets. And you look and you're like, okay, clearly this is for a gun, but there was no gun inside. So our security team, thankfully, they sprung into action, and Steve Bucci, retired professional athlete, reflexes like a cat. Jumped into gear. He and Dave Derone are examining the building, make sure that they're safe. And we have Awana, our Wednesday night children's ministry going on. And so some woman said, yeah, there's a guy walking down the hall I didn't recognize. And so they're just running through the building because they find a bag that looks like there should be a gun in it, and there's no gun. So Steve's thinking, maybe there's a guy in the building walking around with a gun that shouldn't be here, or maybe somebody planted a gun. So he calls the police. And so we just want to let you know that the security team's training, their reflexes did the right thing. They responded the right way. So he calls me, and I'm at home, and I'm just getting home from soccer practice Wednesday night. And he's telling me about this bag. And he just describing it, and immediately I knew. Steve, I'm so sorry, that's my bag. I forgot it because it had been sitting in Isaac Kulam's car since April when we had our young men's cohort and did some target shooting. And I don't own a handgun, and we're not gonna give you the title of Sherlock because you can see these are bullet holes from a .22, and so I don't know many guys that have ill intentions with a .22 handgun for you gun people. But nonetheless, Isaac forgot to hear, and so it was mine. And so what a big relief. I could hear the relief in his voice that, okay, great, I don't have to be worried. It's just our blumbling, forgetful pastor left a handbag on top of the stage. But the reflexes that he had were the right ones. The reflexes he had to the situation were to take it seriously, to make sure that our children were safe. And you think about reflexes, and sometimes reflexes are very natural. You touch a hot pan, and your reflex is to, you pull away from it. Or you go to the doctor, remember they would take that little, triangle thing and bump your knee, and your knee would go kunk, right? And oh, great, your reflexes are working. Some of our reflexes need to be a little more thoughtful, and part of our brain operates in such a way that we have things that we immediately respond to, and some that it passes through the part of our brain that we get to think about for a moment. Oh, I'm hungry, so I'm gonna have the reflex to pick up this food. My reflex for picking up the vegetable or the sugary item is broken. But you have some things in our lives that require us to kind of hone and train those reflexes so that we respond in such a way that we make the right decision. We're gonna see in this chapter this morning, I think one of the things that just stuck out to me right away was what I like to call Joseph's spiritual reflex. His kind of immediate response. And all of that is rooted in how Joseph views God. Joseph has this high view of God. And that's our big idea this morning, is that a high view of God will strengthen our spiritual reflexes amidst trials and tribulations. And so we're gonna take a look at this story, and we're gonna see that the high view of God that Joseph has is one that we can share in. And really I've broken down this story into kind of three sections that I want you to know about God. Is that God has perfect timing. We see that in the first 4 verses. We see that God is worthy to be trusted in verses 5 through 19. And then in verse 20 through 23, I think that we can glean that God's process is perfect. Those are the 3 things I want you to know and take away from this morning. So let's kind of break down this passage together and see what can we continue to glean from the life of Joseph. And I believe that we can glean that a healthy spiritual reflex seeks God in every one of life's challenges. Everything that you face and struggle with, you can respond in such a way with an answer that says, let's seek the Lord in this. Let's go to God. And we'll see Joseph demonstrating this for us. So in verse 1 of chapter 40, it reads, so sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them, and they continued for some time in custody. So last week we continued out of chapter 39, and we saw this phrase speaking of God's presence being with Joseph. We kept hearing that Yahweh was with him. And that's said 8 times in chapter 39. And so that's continuing to carry on in this chapter, this mindset that God is with them. This is the message that Moses wanted the Israelites reading this, wandering the wilderness in Exodus, to hear the story of Joseph and know that God is with them amidst all of this. And so we find Joseph here continuing in prison like we read last week. And remember, he's been sold into slavery by his brothers. He's been falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and now he's imprisoned. And so his life seems just to be filled with all these setbacks and disappointments. But I believe that Joseph continued to trust God's plan for his life that we saw when Joseph was a boy and given dreams. Can you imagine for a moment being wrongfully imprisoned for a crime that you didn't commit? And Joseph's life seemed to be filled with these setbacks and disappointments. I don't know about you, but if I was wrongfully imprisoned and had been betrayed, I would have been looking for every opportunity to bring the spoon after dinner and Shawshank Redemption my way out of prison and dig a hole and get out of there. And Joseph didn't do that. He continued to honor the Lord in everything that he was entrusted with. And because of Yahweh, he's given favor and he's trusted. Remember, Potiphar trusted him and credited that trust to God. Well, how does he know that? Because Joseph must have talked about Yahweh. In a foreign land in Egypt where they had all of these pagan gods, these pagan rituals, they kept hearing Joseph speak about Yahweh, speak about the covenant-making God, the personal, relational God who made a promise to his people, gave Joseph a dream, and hasn't forsaken him, was with him, and Joseph was seeing success because of God, and the Egyptians are hearing about this. They're hearing about this God, and they're learning about him, and therefore they're crediting Joseph's success to Yahweh. And so Joseph's character, as we've seen through the last 3 chapters, was shaped and forged in order that he would be trusted by the authorities over him. Look at verse 4. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in his custody. Joseph was the one who was in prison, and yet he's put in charge of these 2 guys that Pharaoh was upset with. And we don't know the specific offense, but some commentators believe that because they were both involving food, that there was probably some kind of sickness that had taken over Pharaoh, and he felt that there was some foul play. The cupbearer who was supposed to make sure that he drank clean, non-poisonous food, and the baker who was supposed to prepare his food for him. And so he threw both of them in prison until he could figure out what's going on. And Joseph is given the guys who sinned against the greatest ruler in the land, he's overseeing them. This is fantastic to see the drama taking place in this story. And so God has this perfect timing because the divine setup here that is going on, that Joseph has been placed here with God's hand orchestrating the meeting between him and these two officials. All along, we can see the meta-narrative going on in the story of Joseph is that God's given him this promise. He's sold into slavery, this traumatic moment, being human trafficked, sold, not being able to have any autonomy. And then why is he going through all of this? And we know that eventually it's going to land with him being able to rescue and redeem Jacob and his family. But he has to go through all of this trouble to get there. And so we see God's sovereign threads weaving in and out of this story. And so here again, we see God's timing is perfect. So in the darkest moments of our lives, God often sets the stage for his purpose to unfold. Do we believe that? And just as he brought Joseph to interpret these dreams, he has a plan for each of us. He has a plan for each of you. What you are going through, what you have experienced is not meaningless. You need to know that God orchestrates and rules over all of it. And so in verse 5, let's read together the baker and the cupbearer. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" There's a couple things I think we can glean from this. First, each of the men are given unique dreams. And dreams can be enigmatic. They can leave us kind of perplexed. I don't know that we read this text and say, hey, I can with confidence go and think I can now interpret dreams because of all these illustrations. We see patterns of different dreams that are given to individuals throughout Scripture. But Joseph is going to be clearly gifted the ability by Yahweh to interpret these dreams. And that's from God, of God. I would be cautious that we would read these dreams and think, now I can go interpret dreams. Like, oh, I had a dream, of a bunch of crows landing on Bill Belichick's car, so that means he's getting fired this week. Like, nope, probably not gonna happen. So I'm not putting confidence in that, but we can experience some of these, and we're gonna face moments in our lives that they're gonna leave us feeling uncertain or maybe even feeling confused. And the thing that these men were experiencing was what Joseph sees. He could observe and sense that this is going on within them. And his response is very interesting here. See, he says, or the text says, when he came in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. I think this is interesting because Joseph, remember, he's gone through a lot. He could have just been callous and been like, who cares? These guys are in prison. I've been mistreated. I'm not going to give them the time of day. I'm just going to leave them in their cell. But that's not his response. His response is that he sees them troubled, and then he asks them, why are your faces downcast today? Like, why are you troubled? And so the text says that they were in there for some time. So Joseph, I'm assuming, probably was able to observe them, have conversations, is communicating with them. I think that this demonstrates Joseph's empathetic awareness. He had empathy for these guys. He felt for them. I think that he probably was able to feel for that because he himself was in prison wrongfully. Maybe he felt like they were too. I think that he's experienced this in such a way so that he could then have empathy for them. And turn with me briefly. Paul has this similar idea in 2 Corinthians. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, he kind of articulates the same example. He says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort." So he's talking, again, high view of God. God is the one who is comforting. And then he says in verse 4, who comforts us in all our affliction so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort which we ourselves are comforted by God. Okay, this is I think summarizes the character of Joseph well, that he's able to have empathy because of what he's gone through, but he's able to also trust in God's promises, trust in the visions that God has given him, trust in the fact that Yahweh is with him, that even though he's been forsaken and forgotten by his family, that he's not forsaken or forgotten by Yahweh. And so his hope in God inspired empathy and service. And so for us, hope in God inspires generous service to others. They don't deserve me to serve them, but because I have experienced Yahweh, the love and grace and mercy of God, I can then understand that he comforts and then share that with others who are experiencing difficulty in their life. Does that fuel us to respond that way like Joseph does? And so in verse 7, he asks Pharaoh's officers who are with him in custody in his master's house, why are your faces downcast today? And this is the verse that I love. They said to him, we have had dreams and there's no one to interpret them. So in Egyptian culture, people made a living off of interpreting dreams, whether it was the lady with the crystal ball or card readers or whatever their pagan society had created. People would go and pay somebody to tell them their fortune or tell them what their dreams meant, and they lived in this very mystical society. There was all kinds of gods in Egypt. They had a god for everything: water, sun, moon, death, all of these different things. And they looked for meaning in all these small, minute details. And so they wanted to understand what this meant. And so they're stuck in prison and they're distraught because they're having these dreams and they're like, well, I'm not gonna be able to pay a dream interpreter. I'm stuck. Well, and Joseph's response is magnificent. He says to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Do not interpretations belong to Yahweh? This is speaking from experience. Remember, Joseph's given dreams. God gave him multiple dreams. And as a boy, he goes and shares those with his family. He believed in them. He believed in the promise that Yahweh was giving him. And so his response is magnificent because not only has he not stopped believing in Yahweh after all he's been through, he hasn't lost hope in the character and promises of God, but he hasn't lost the reflex to turn to God. Please tell them to me. Joseph's high view of God gave him confidence to respond, do not interpretations belong to God? After all the suffering, he's not angry at God. He doesn't think less of God. He has a high view of God. God has perfect timing. God is worthy to be trusted. And so his spiritual reflex is, let's go to Yahweh. Let's turn to God. Is your natural response to turn to God? Is that your natural reflex? Something's going on in my life. Let's go to God. Let's go to his word. Let's remember. Let's pray. Let's seek spiritual wisdom counsel. Let's go to the Lord. One of my favorite childhood verses that I memorized is Proverbs 3, 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but acknowledge him in all your ways and he will direct your paths. That is the God that Joseph believes in, Yahweh. I can have a reflex that says, man, I'm going through something. Let's go to God. He is the authority over all. Is your high view of God leading your spiritual reflex? So Joseph's interpretation in verses 9 through 19 is gonna be God giving and revealing the meaning of these dreams to these men through Joseph. So read with me. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dreams, there was a vine before me. And on the vine, there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days.
In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. And then in verse 14, he says, only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that should be put me into the pit. Twice he's been thrown into a pit, in a sense, right? His brothers threw him into a pit, then he's thrown into the pit in jail. And so Joseph, through the power of God, interprets this dream, gives this cupbearer a good fortune. God is going to restore you. Pharaoh's going to call you back in 3 days. You're going to get to have your old job. You'll be out of prison. But please don't forget me. And Joseph shares his story, what he's gone through, hoping this man will remember him and be part of his redemptive arc. And so Joseph understands, I'm here for no good reason. It's not justified. We're going to experience injustice in our lives. Does it make us bitter to God? Or do we still have the ability to turn to God and say, do I trust him? Let's go to Yahweh. This is Joseph. What a man. And so in verse 16, when the chief baker saw the interpretation was favorable, oh yeah, he got good news. Maybe I'll get some good news too. He said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. And on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. And then in verse 23, it says this, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. You see, Joseph could be sitting here wondering, what is going on with this process? God, you've given me this vision for what I am to become. Why am I going through all of this? What is happening? I've been forgotten again. If you read just a little bit in verse 1 of chapter 41, it says after 2 whole years. 2 years. I'm worried in 5 minutes if I don't hear from my wife that she's forgotten me. I'm texting, oh no, right? 2 years he's waiting. The cupbearer forgot Joseph's request until Pharaoh has a dream. So Joseph absolutely could be wondering, why? Why the 2 years? And interestingly enough, Moses is silent here. Moses is silent. And he doesn't give us anything extra that happens in these 2 years. It's just quiet. We don't get to insight on that struggle. And so just think for a moment. There's a lot that happens over 2 years. There's a lot of routine and wondering and thinking and questioning. But the text doesn't let us know. But we don't see Joseph playing the victim. We don't see Joseph discrediting God. No, he believes in the Lord. I like how the commentator V. Raidman Edmonds said, delay never thwarts God's purpose. It only polishes his instrument. Sometimes those seasons of drought or seasons of waiting where we're saying, why can't you act, God? Why can't I have the promise given now? Why do I need to wait? It's because he's not done polishing us. You see, disappointment, it's going to be part of your life. But I think Joseph is a great example that we can move through that and still come out with hope and faith within our own heart. And we, like Joseph, we can be a people that trust God's sovereignty and his faithfulness during our trials. That my reflex is not to doubt, but my reflex is to trust. My reflex is to say, let's go to Yahweh. Let's trust in Yahweh. One of the fun things that Pastor Talley did, sometimes maybe he still does, and so I think this bag is my way of continuing his little tradition of testing the reflexes of our security team, is that he would place this wonderful, magnificent cardboard Jesus throughout the building. And just to test, I think particularly his dear friend Steve's reflexes, but he'd hide it behind a door, or he'd put it in a room that they didn't expect anybody to be in. And you walk by really quickly and you see a silhouette of a man, and that will catch you off guard. I have walked into many bathroom stalls and been startled by this thing. And so it became fun. And so, but I think that there's this fun little piece of thinking that I can go through things not knowing what's gonna happen, not knowing what I'm gonna encounter, not knowing what's behind the door. Is it a cardboard cutout of Jesus, or is it something worse? But I can trust that God's process is perfect. And I want you to hear this very clearly, that hope in God alone is the key to overcoming disappointment and despair. And we have to train our reflexes to know that we're not going to encounter simple things in our life like a cardboard cutout of Jesus, but we're going to encounter things that are much more serious. And how do we view those serious things in our lives? James chapter 1, if you turn there briefly with me, has some words of wisdom for us. He says this in verse 2 through 4. He says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." If that does not describe the life of Joseph, I don't know what will. This is God blessing Joseph to shape and forge him into a man of faithfulness. And God forges him through his suffering, but also through Yahweh's faithfulness to him. And so God's timing, we trust, is perfect. And so Joseph is remembered when the time is right and when his purpose is to be fulfilled. And we'll unpack some more of that last week. But in those seasons of waiting, I believe that Joseph resonated with the Apostle Paul's words in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And Paul experienced great adversity, and he's speaking here to a church that was dealing with a lot of icky stuff. And he's talking about just the struggle to follow the Lord, to serve the Lord, and he's dealing with this thorn in his flesh. He's being harassed, he's dealing with great adversity. And he says this in chapter 12, verse 9. "But he said to me," being Jesus, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Do you believe in those seasons of your life that you can turn to Yahweh and you can say, your grace is sufficient? The unmerited favor that you have given me, the promise that you have given me is sufficient for me to endure, for me to remain faithful. I'm not in a season of prosperity. I'm not in a season of wealth. I'm not even seeing wins or victories in my life. But your grace is sufficient for me to continue to be faithful. Joseph is one of the greatest examples of this. And I want you to know that God's grace is always sufficient if we would receive it. It is always sufficient. Sometimes we feel like we got to resist it. I got to come up with the plan. I got to get the spoon. I got to dig my way out of here. I'm going to take things into my own control. But can we wait on the Lord? Can we trust him? Can we give our lives to him, saying that we're going to live and love you, Lord, because you're worthy, because you are ruler over all, that my reflex is to say, praise Yahweh, praise God. Count it all joy when I endure trials.